November 1945. Lough Foyle lies under a low pewter sky. Wind slides off the hills of Derry and rakes the anchorage. Steel hulls sit high, drained of life, their decks slick with frost. The U-boats are silent, hatches dogged shut, no diesel thrum, no lookouts, only gulls and the creak of wet hemp. Royal Navy tugs nose forward, engines growling. Tow lines heave taut, spray lifting in sheets as the first surrendered boats edge from the moorings. Out in Loch Ryan, the same ritual plays out in mirror. Dozens of submarines in rows, numbers chalked, scars of depth charge near misses etched along their flanks. The war that made them feared is over. The ocean that almost crowned them ruler now prepares to swallow them whole. A petty officer in a duffel coat signals with a gloved hand. Another line goes over. A wave slaps hard against a conning tower and breaks into a flurry of ice. The procession turns toward the Atlantic, past the last low lights of shore, toward grid squares chosen for depth and silence. This is the beginning of Operation Deadlight. But to understand why these boats must die at sea, we need to see how they came to be corralled here at war's end. They were never meant to gather like this. The U-boat arm was built to hunt alone, to stalk in packs, to vanish. Instead, in May 1945, the survivors came in under orders. They surfaced into surrender. On 30 April, Adolf Hitler was dead in Berlin. Within hours, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed command from the North German enclave around Flensburg. He inherited ruins and a submarine force still scattered across the Atlantic, the Arctic approaches, and the Bay of Biscay. Through the winter of 1944-45, the U-boats had clung to new hopes, snorkels to evade radar-hunting aircraft, and revolutionary hulls on the drawing boards. Type Duttiman, Type 23. True submarines, fast underwater, able to charge batteries in relative safety. But the war moved faster. Allied escort carriers, improved sonar, centimetric radar, long-range patrols from Iceland to the Azores, together they had turned the ocean into a net. Losses were crushing. In 1943, the Black May of the U-boat arm broke the back of its offensive. The last 2 years were attrition and retreat. By spring 1945, the Atlantic supply line was secure. For the men of the U-boat Waffe, survival meant surrender or scuttling. Dönitz understood the symbolism. Among his first acts was to consider Operation Regenbogen, a fleet-wide self-destruction to deny the enemy trophies. The order flickered and died almost as soon as it was born. He rescinded it under Allied pressure and to avoid reprisals against crews trapped in harbors. The armistice process moved quickly. On 4th May, German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands capitulated to Field Marshal Montgomery at Lüneburg Heath. On 7th May, the unconditional surrender was signed at Reims, effective 8 May. Allied Naval Command broadcast instructions into the ether. To all U-boats, cease hostilities, surface immediately. Fly a black flag. Report your position. Proceed to designated reception points under escort. Do not destroy machinery. Do not jettison documents. Do not scuttle. They came in on the grey swell, from the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic stations, from training areas in the Baltic that were still accessible. The first British reception point was Loch Erebol, a remote, deep-water anchorage on the north coast of Scotland. It was chosen for isolation, seaworthiness, and control. There, beginning around 10–11 May, U-boats arrived singly or in small groups, numbers chalked on conning towers, flak guns silent, crews lined on deck with hands raised or at attention. Boarding parties brought them in, searched for demolition charges, removed Enigma rotors and code tables where they still existed, and posted guards. From Erebol, and from other temporary anchorages, the flotillas were staged south and west. 2 great holding pens formed, Loch Ryan, on the Scottish side of the North Channel, and Lisa Halley, at the head of Lough Foyle in Northern Ireland, within the Western Approaches Command sphere. On 14th of May 1945, a formal ceremony at Lisa Halley marked the surrender of U-boats to the Allies. British, American, and Soviet naval representatives stood on the quay, while a small line of German submarines, under British control, eased in as a symbolic handover. It was theatre with steel, underscoring that the Battle of the Atlantic had ended in Allied hands. By summer's end, rows of U-boats lay moored at Loch Ryan and Lough Foyle. Type Cersei and Ninth workhorses rubbed fenders with the sleek, late-war Type 22 and tiny coastal Type 43. Many more had been destroyed in German ports by their crews in early May, sunk in place to block harbors or deny capture. But what survived in British custody was substantial. The Allies counted hulls, checked machinery, and took notes. Engineers peered into battery compartments. Divers inspected the fathoms below for any scuttling charges that had slipped past. Strategists saw something else. The war was over, but the next adversary was already being imagined. The advanced German designs were years ahead in some respects. If distributed without restraint, they could redraw naval power balances overnight. Yet the United Kingdom could not crew, maintain, or berth a captured U-boat fleet through winter. Nor would the United States or the Soviet Union tolerate the other keeping too many of the spoils. A decision had to be made. What to learn, what to share, and what to erase. That decision would soon take the name Operation Deadlight. But before the scuttling orders were signed, committees and commissions would weigh the fate of every hull tied up in those cold anchorages. The decision fell to the new arbiters of the peace. In the late summer of 1945, the Tripartite Naval Commission, British, American, Soviet, convened to divide what remained of the German Navy and to prevent tomorrow S problems from being forged out of yesterday S weapons. Their subcommittee on U-boats toured Loch Ryan and Lough Foyle, chalk lists in hand, peering at batteries, snorkel heads, and the clean lines of the electro-boot. They chose a small number for study, roughly 10 for each of the three powers, with a few others earmarked for Allied navies that had fought at sea and had the need and capacity, France and Norway among them. The rest were surplus to politics and to prudence. A deadline anchored the work. By order of the Commission, all U-boats not allocated were to be destroyed by early 1946. The date fixed in British planning was 1st of February. The Royal Navy would execute the task. It was not to be a bonfire at the quay. The boats had to go where they could not be found again. Deep water. Far enough from the shelf to make salvage uneconomic and dangerous. Quiet enough to avoid hazard to navigation. Charts were studied. Soundings marked. 3 scuttling boxes were plotted well to the west and northwest of Malin Head, beyond the edge where the seabed falls away. The plan acquired a name: Operation Deadlight. It would move in serials, small convoys of hulks towed by fleet, and commercial tugs, shepherded by escorts armed to finish what the ocean began. The U-boats would be stripped of obvious war stores, any surviving cryptographic gear, and some instruments. Demolition teams would fit charges in a few, others would be left to gunfire. Recovery crews inspected valves and through-hull fittings. Many boats were already in poor condition. Surrendering crews had sabotaged machinery. Rain and salt had penetrated where seals failed. Some batteries were swollen or inert. On more than one hull, the conning tower plates were cracked from near misses and ice. Routes were laid with care. From Lisa Halley, a line out past Moville and the mouth of the Foyle, hugging the North Channel before turning west. From Loch Ryan, the exit past the peninsula at Stranraer and the open reach to a rendezvous seamark off Innistrahull. From there, a dogleg onto the plotted tracks toward the scuttling boxes. Weather windows were brief. Winter seas in the North Atlantic are not merciful. Planning assumptions took account of tow speeds as low as 4 knots, and the likelihood of breaking seas rolling over the low decks of submarines that rode oddly without fuel or trim. Command rested in the Western Approaches organization that had once fought to protect convoys on these same waters. Orders emphasized control and safety. Keep the tows short. Keep ballast manageable. Keep the course and report positions. If a boat began to founder, abandon the plan and sink her where she lay, so long as it posed no risk to fishing grounds or the main shipping lanes. Units were assigned from available tugs and escort vessels, with air stations on standby in case an aerial strike was needed to hasten a reluctant hull to the bottom. Secrecy was practical, not theatrical. There was no need to advertise that dozens of submarines were being towed out to die. Local papers recorded the lines of gray hulls and the bad weather, but little else. For the men on the tugs and escorts, it was work that felt like an epilogue, done under low clouds and early dusk. Papers were signed, lists finalized, boats marked with white surrender bands and new numbers were queued. When the first weather break opened, the tow bridles went on and engines came to life. By late November 1945, with the deadline fixed ahead, the procession began to form at the moorings and the Atlantic waited beyond the headlands. The first serials went out in late November 1945. Grey light, breath turning to vapor on the decks. Tow bridles bit into tired steel. Each U-boat rode oddly high, stripped of fuel and armament, with ballast uncertain after months idle at moorings. The escorts took station. The tugs leaned on their lines. The whole file eased past the headlands into a long, cold swell. They were bound for coded boxes on the chart, areas A, B, and C, deep water northwest of Ireland, where the seabed dropped away. Western Approaches signal rooms tracked them as if they were convoys, plotting positions, logging weather. 4 knots on a good day, less when the sea built. The winter Atlantic did not care about schedules. Wind veered. Seas came steep and confused. Spray froze on railings. Lines hummed and snapped in sudden gusts. Even before the first scuttling area was reached, the ocean started choosing its own sites. A U-boat would begin to wallow, take water through a seam, and heel. The tug would shorten up, trying to keep the bow up. An escort would edge in close, ready to take the crew off the stricken hull. If the tow parted, there was no heroics. The orders were clear: sink her where she lay, so long as the position was safe. Gun crews trained in. The first rounds cracked out into the wind. Armor-piercing shells broke into thin pressure hulls not designed to shrug off surface gunfire. Water poured in. Air hissed out. The boat seemed to hesitate, then dipped, stern first or beam first, in an untidy surrender to gravity. On the better days, the serials reached the plotted boxes. There, the work grew methodical. Parties went aboard to set scuttling charges, or to open sea valves that could still be worked. The choreography was practiced. Lines eased away. A signal arm rose. The charges thumped dull under the sea. Hatches that were not dogged tight burped air. A periscope quivered, then slid under. Gunfire finished the stubborn ones. The escort's logs filled with entries. So many rounds of 4-inch. So many minutes to sinking. Oil streak noted. Position given. Not all boats behaved the same. The small coastal Type V3 hulls were quick to drown, light and with little reserve buoyancy. The older Type 7 and 9, unladen and without their batteries at full weight, sometimes clung to the surface in a way that surprised even gunners used to sinking merchantmen. More than once, an escort had to close to short range, raking the thin casing, and the pressure hull underneath, until a seam opened and the ocean took the decision out of human hands. Aircraft stood by on some days, watching through breaks in the weather, and in a few cases added rockets or bombs to end an argument with a stubborn target. There were near misses and small dramas that never made headlines. A tow swung too close in a gust and kissed an escort S-hull with a clang that echoed down the mess deck. A scuttling charge failed to fire on time, and men waited longer than they liked before going back aboard to check a wet fuse. A rigger lost a glove, and then his grip to a wave that filled the boat deck like a basin. He was hauled back by a mate who never let go of the lanyard. In the evening, in the lee of the escorts, the tug's crews drank tea that steamed the glass of the wheelhouse and watched foam streak past in the dying light. Names and numbers were chalked off the lists. Some carried reputations from the war, now reduced to a line in a report. Others were late-war hulls that had never fought, surrendered straight from trials or training. All of them, in Allied paperwork, became a line item under a single code word: Deadlight. The work went on through early December, paused, and then picked up between gales. Dozens of hulls slid down through the green, struck bottom miles below, and settled at attitudes dictated by slope and current. A few were lost close enough to land that fishermen would feel their nets strain, years later, and curse the snags on the chart. The escorts learned the rhythm of it: out, tow, sink, back. The tugs learned which cleats on a U-boat deck were least likely to tear loose under sudden strain. Logistics officers measured progress against a February deadline that did not move. Yet this was only the first phase. Winter had not finished. The most advanced hulls were still in the lines, and the pace would have to quicken if the Royal Navy was to meet the clock that Moscow and Washington were watching. By mid-December, the weather closed its fist. The second phase of Deadlight began with barometers falling and ice collecting on jackstays. The timetable did not yield. Orders were blunt: keep sailing. The tows grew tighter, escorts closer. Tugs went out with extra wire and spare bridles, knowing some would part before the first set of coordinates appeared on the chart table. The advanced hulls came up in the rotation. The Electroboot, type 21 and the smaller 23, had been the terror in waiting of the late war. Underwater speed that made escorts rethink their doctrine. Recharge rates that could have severed the tie between submarines and the surface. A handful had been retained for trials by each of the great powers and by Allied navies that had bled in the Atlantic. The rest were marked for the deep. They looked different in tow: smooth casing, raked fairings, no deck gun. On a clear morning, you could imagine how they would have moved submerged. Electric motors humming, vanishing from radar and from the old Atlantic grammar of hunt and sprint. On the surface in winter, they were as mortal as any hull. The pace picked up. Serial after serial slid out past the headlands. Lough Foyle emptied a little each week. Loch Ryan's rows thinned. Western approaches, HQ tracked them all the same. Printouts curling under the heat of a lamp, fix after fix plotted in pencil. At sea the work hardened into routine. Approach the box, put a boarding party across, open what valves would move. Set charges where safe. Ease off the tow. Open the range. Fire. Sometimes the shells sparked along the casing before finding a seam. Sometimes the periscope standard folded at the base, with a sound like a tree going down. Often the boat sagged slowly, as if trying to bargain with the ocean, then let go and went. Not every sinking was clean. More than one U-boat failed long before the plotted grid. The cold had found the weak points. A cracked plate at the tower, a manhole gasket perished and porous, bilges filling with every white-topped wave. When the bow began to dig and the stern to lift, the tow went slack and then taut, and everyone on the tug felt the moment when the decision was made for them. Cut free. Take the position. Put her down here. Gun crews learned to place shots low, to let water in where frames were thin. A few days, when the sea was too bad to work guns, the escorts waited for a lull, while the condemned hull lay beam on to the swell and collected water through every opening it could find. There were other methods. Depth charges rolled over the stern at short settings to jar open plates. A hedgehog pattern thrown close aboard to bite through thin metal. In rare cases, a call went to a nearby air station, and an aircraft came in low between squalls, its rockets fussing the waterline until steel lost its argument with pressure and sea. The men who did this work recorded it without adjectives. Sunk by gunfire. Foundered under tow. Scuttling charges successful. Positions with degrees and minutes, wind force in Beaufort numbers, oil slick 200 yards long. Christmas passed at anchor and at sea, marked by tea gone cold on a chart table and a letter opened in a lee. January 1946 saw the ledger tighten. The deadline set by the Tripartite Naval Commission loomed. The Soviet delegates asked for updates. The Americans did too. The British planners answered with numbers and dates and asked for a little weather luck. It came in scraps, enough to push the last crowded weeks. In those weeks, some of the most modern hulls went down in quick succession, judged too costly to keep and too dangerous to leave. One or two were spared even then, diverted at the last moment to join trials programs already underway in British yards. The rest took their bearings from the wind and disappeared. In the end, the convoys felt smaller, emptier. The moorings at Lisahali fell quiet. The shore parties at Loch Ryan packed their gear into crates and waited for their next posting. The last serials went out into broken weather, alone or in pairs, with the frigate's bridge windows whitening under blown spray. Gunfire in the afternoon, a column of steam from a charge at depth, a swirl of oil, silence. A Ship S company looked at the place where the water had been disturbed and then looked away. The work was complete by early February. A few stragglers, delayed by damage or decisions above the waterline, followed the main body into the deep in the days that followed. In the western approaches, a clerk closed a file with a code word that had done its job. Under the Atlantic, at the edge of the continental shelf, steel lay quiet, stacked by slope and accident, a graveyard without markers. With the sinkings done, the reckoning began. What had been learned, what had been denied to a world already shifting into a different kind of tension, and what the ocean now kept in trust for the future. By early February 1946, the ledger closed. Operation Deadlight had sent 116 surrendered U-boats to the bottom between 17 November 1945 and 11th February 1946. They were part of a larger haul, about 156 submarines, that gave themselves up in May and June, after thousands more had been scuttled in German waters or lost at sea. The remainder not sunk under Deadlight were pulled aside for trials, instruction, or handover to Allied navies under the Tripartite Naval Commission's framework. The division was deliberate. The Commission capped retention at roughly 30 boats, 10 each for the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union, so no single navy could rebuild a German U-boat arm under a new flag. A few additional hulls went to close allies from those shares. France received a Type 21 U-2518. She re-entered service as Roland Morio, a sleek testimony to the Electro-boot's promise, and served into the 1960s. Norway took several Type 7s for training. One of them, U-995, would survive the Cold War to become a museum on the Baltic shore. The United States put U-2513 and U-3008 through exhaustive trials. President Harry Truman even visited U-2513 off Key West in 1946 before she ended her days as a target ship. The Royal Navy raised the scuttled U-1307, fitted with Helmuth Walter's high-test peroxide turbine, and recommissioned her as HMS Meteorite, an experimental path that would echo years later in the British Explorer class. The rest of the story was destruction by design. Deadlight S-log tells how the steel went down. Many boats sank cleanly in the plotted deep-water boxes under gunfire and scuttling charges. A significant fraction foundered under tow before reaching the lines on the chart, their tired plates giving way in winter seas. Positions were entered in degrees and minutes. Weather noted. Oil slicks described in yards. The reports were dry by intent. No sentiment. Just the methodical closing out of a threat that had nearly strangled an island nation. The strategic consequences were immediate. Allied engineers stripped the survivors for knowledge before they vanished beneath the waves. The snorkel, once controversial, became standard. Hydrodynamic streamlining, long battery endurance, and quieting moved from German experiment to Allied doctrine. In the United States, the Guppy program began in 1947, cutting down old conning towers, enlarging battery capacity, and reshaping fleet boats into faster, quieter predators under the surface. In Britain, the lessons folded into new post-war designs. By the 1950s, the Porpoise class would wear a hull form and silencing logic that owed much to the Type 21S clean lines. The Soviet Navy drew on the same trove of ideas, fielding Project 613, Whiskey, and Project 611, Zulu boats in numbers that suggested a new contest was already at hand. Strategists took note. If a diesel-electric submarine could move fast underwater and hide behind a snorkel at periscope depth, then wartime anti-submarine logic had to be rewritten. Sonar sets improved. Forward-throwing mortars refined what Hedgehog had started. Air coverage widened. Hunter-killer groups re-entered doctrine with a different quarry in mind. The balance of fear shifted too. Winston Churchill later wrote that, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." In 1946, with Deadlight complete, that peril seemed buried. But the technology that had nearly made it decisive was now in the toolkits of navies who might one day face each other. In ports where the rows of grey hulls had been, the quiet felt final. Lisa Halley's quays cleared. Loch Ryan's moorings fell empty. On the seabed, beyond the continental shelf, the graveyard lay undisturbed, its coordinates scattered across Admiralty charts, and the memories of men who had watched the swirls of oil fade. Decades would pass before that silence was broken again, this time by survey ships, divers, and the questions that follow when wrecks become both relics and risks. They went back to look for them, not at once. Years passed. Then hydrographic ships, sonar arrays humming, began to paint the seabed northwest of Ireland with lines of sound. The shapes appeared first as smudges, then as distinct silhouettes, long cylinders, broken fairings, the upright ribs of pressure hulls torn open by charges or by the sea. Maritime archaeologists joined in. Divers, when the depth allowed, dropped through cold green water to visit what the charts called obstructions. They found conning towers lying on their sides, open hatches, periscopes bent like grass in a storm, numbers faint under weed. Work by the UK Hydrographic Office, the Irish seabed mapping programs, and university teams linked positions to logs. Dozens of Deadlight wrecks were identified with confidence. Some lay in groups where the Royal Navy had staged the sinkings in December and January. Others were strung along tow routes like punctuation marks in a story the weather had interrupted. Innes McCartney and other researchers tied hulls to entries in the Western Approaches records and to the terse language of wartime paperwork. Sank under tow, destroyed by gunfire, position verified, until the graveyard had names again. A few boats sat in depths within reach of technical divers. U-778, which foundered under tow on 4 December 1945, lay in about 70 meters of water off Inishowen. In the 2000s, a plan briefly surfaced to raise her and bring a U-boat to Derry as a memorial. The funding never matched the intent. The Atlantic kept what it had taken. Elsewhere, trawlers discovered the wrecks in a different way, by the sudden surge of tension in a net and the hard limit of a snag on an echo sounder. Mariners added warnings to local charts and learned where not to set a line. Questions followed the maps. What did these wrecks release? Most Deadlight boats had been stripped of torpedoes and war stores. Many surrendered with fuel tanks nearly empty. Even so, steel corrodes, oil clings, batteries, where they remained, leach their chemistry into water. Environmental assessments in recent decades have watched the area with a cautious eye. Cold, depth, and dispersion have so far muted the worst fears, but the wrecks are not inert. They are slow processes written in iron and salt. The heritage question runs alongside. In Germany, U-995 sits on the sand at Laboe, a museum preserved against sky and wind. In Birkenhead, the raised U-534, sunk in May 1945 and not part of Deadlight, shows the engineering of the type in the open. The Deadlight boats, by contrast, are memorials you cannot visit. Their story is written in archive files at Kew and in logbooks held in Liverpool and Portsmouth, in photographs taken at Loch Ryan and Lough Foyle, and in the recollections of men who were young on cold decks when the last tows went out. Oral histories housed by the Imperial War Museum record voices, noting the quiet of those days, the odd sadness in work that had no enemy and no return fire. At the old moorings, little remains. Lisa Halley's shore is a commercial edge, its wartime silhouettes remembered by a plaque and by local memory. Loch Ryan's waters are busy with ferries and fishing boats. The wartime military port at Cairnryan dismantled fleets in the 1950s. Today, only concrete and slope recall the traffic of another era. The lines of U-boats that once lay there exist now in a handful of images and in the shade of a map. For decades, Deadlight stayed quiet in the public imagination, overshadowed by surrenders on land and by the beginning of the atomic age. It has returned, as the seabed has yielded its outlines, and as navies and historians have retraced the path from the Battle of the Atlantic into the Cold War that followed. In the end, the operation was a hinge. It closed one chapter of undersea warfare, and, by what it kept and what it buried, opened another. Those choices, what to learn, what to sink, what to remember, are the bridge to a calmer reckoning. Those choices reverberate. The men at Lisa Halley and Loch Ryan decided what would be studied and what would be erased. In doing so, they drew a line across the ocean and across time. One path led downward, into cold and darkness. The other ran forward, into drawing offices, test tanks and slipways. Deadlight was an act of control. Not triumphal, not vengeful. Practical. Remove a threat. Deny a symbol. Keep the peace just long enough for a different order to take hold. The Allies did not simply bury steel. They buried a doctrine that had come close to starving Britain and bending strategy to fear. Yet, in the same breath, they kept its most potent ideas alive. Snorkels, streamlined hulls, quiet electrics. The paradox of 1946 is clear. The U-boats went down, and their descendants rose everywhere. The ocean kept its own counsel. It received the hulls without ceremony and folded them into silt and slope. No markers, no altars, only coordinates and the faintest returns on a sounder. That anonymity carries a lesson. Industrial war leaves more than monuments. It leaves decisions scattered across maps, and the sea keeps most of them out of sight. There is a human ledger, too. Young sailors on tugs and escorts, writing sunk by gunfire in neat hands. German crews who had surfaced to surrender, then watched their former ships towed away to an end they could not witness. Engineers leaning over battery wells, seeing in the future what the present could not afford to keep. Their work bridged two eras without a speech. It was the quiet, competent labor that makes grand strategy possible. In the decades that followed, new submarines traced silent routes over the same ground. NATO and Warsaw pact boats practiced a new kind of deterrence in the old hunting lanes. Sonar swept across places where the U-boats lay and brought back a textured silence. The Cold War ended. The wrecks remained. Operation Deadlight is not a tale of battle. It is the last page of one book and the first line of another. It asks what a victorious world does with the tools that nearly defeated it. It answers with a horizon, a winter sea, and steel lying still under the weight of history.